What if the most terrifying monsters don't hide in shadows, but smile in plain sight? What if evil doesn't come with a warning, but with a soft voice, a kind gesture, a familiar face? Luis Alfredo Garavito was one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history, responsible for the torture, abuse, and murder of over 160 children in Colombia during the 1990s. And yet, for years, he walked freely among the people, blending in with the very society he was dismantling from within. He didn't hide behind violence, he hid behind empathy, or at least its imitation. Garavito wasn't the image of a predator. There was no monstrous appearance, no erratic behavior that made people cross the street. He wore second-hand clothes, offered help to those in need, even spoke kindly to his victims, until the moment the mask slipped. This isn't just a story of what he did, but how he was able to do it. Have you ever wondered what truly drives a mind like this? Not just the horror of the acts themselves, but the chilling calmness behind them, the psychological structure that allowed such darkness to exist beneath such banality. Stay with me. The truths we are about to uncover go deeper than you might expect. To understand Garavito is to confront a disturbing paradox, how something so ordinary can harbor something so unspeakable. And it all begins with the illusion he crafted so effortlessly. A smile that meant nothing, a kindness that was never real. This dissonance between what was seen and what was truly there is what makes Garavito's case so psychologically unsettling. He didn't operate in the shadows. He became part of the background, part of the fabric of daily life. And perhaps that is the most frightening truth of all, that a predator of such magnitude could so easily pass as harmless. If you are drawn to real psychological inquiry, not easy narratives, Criminal Psychology Unmasked was made for you. Consider subscribing or check if you're already part of this space where we explore, not excuse. Your presence here means we're not just telling stories, we're asking deeper questions. Does understanding their mind bring us closer to preventing such acts, or only deeper into the mystery? I would love to hear your view. Your reflections help keep this conversation alive, because to understand someone like Garavito, we have to look past the crimes and into the architecture of deception itself. His mask wasn't just a disguise, it was his greatest weapon. And what allowed that mask to function was society's own tendency to believe that evil always looks evil. But what happens when it doesn't? Let's take a closer look at how Luis Alfredo Garavito studied, selected, and approached his victims, not as people, but as opportunities within a broken system. Garavito's ability to move unnoticed wasn't just a matter of appearance. It was rooted in his chilling understanding of how to read vulnerability. He didn't chase his victims, he studied them. He observed boys who lived on the margins, who sold candy on the street or begged for coins at bus terminals. He knew which ones looked hungry, which ones avoided eye contact, which ones wouldn't be missed if they vanished. These weren't spontaneous choices. They were calculated selections shaped by a predator's cold logic. One investigator later testified that Garavito often carried small gifts, food or alcohol, not for himself, but as bait. In his own words, captured during interrogation, he said, "They came because they trusted me. They needed someone, and I became that someone." That statement reveals more than strategy. It reveals a transformation in identity. Garavito didn't just impersonate a helpful stranger. He became, in his own mind, the answer to the child's need. Not a threat, but a solution. This inversion of empathy, turning human connection into a weapon, exposes the most disturbing element of his mental architecture. It wasn't rage driving him. It was access, control. The moment a child accepted a soft voice or a kind hand, Garavito's plan began to unfold. Court transcripts later described how he would walk with the child into an isolated area, often an abandoned field or patch of forest, speaking calmly, reassuringly. One survivor who escaped said Garavito never stopped smiling even when I started to cry. That smile was part of the mechanism. It wasn't comfort, it was detachment. A mask worn so long it became indistinguishable from identity. Now let's go even deeper into this, because the complexity of this mind doesn't end here. The way he inflicted suffering wasn't just about violence. It was about control over every stage of the experience. If this analysis sparked something inside you, leave in the comments. There's always a hidden layer. To understand the true depth of Garavito's violence, we must stop looking at it as a chaotic outburst and begin to see it as structure, as a ritual he meticulously rehearsed, refined, and repeated. Investigators found that in nearly every crime scene, the same items appeared: bottles of liquor, strips of tape, sharp objects, and religious pamphlets. These were not random elements, they were symbols, perhaps, or tools in a personal script that only he understood. In court, one prosecutor described it not as murder, but as a performance of control, enacted step by step, down to the final breath. Garavito did not just want to dominate the physical body of his victims, he wanted to orchestrate the entire experience. Survivors and forensic analysts noted that he often began by drinking heavily, not to dull his senses, but to enter what he later called a different state. In one chilling moment during interrogation, he stated, "I became someone else, a stronger man, the one who had power." That transformation reveals more than just an altered state of mind. It suggests a deliberate mental division, a compartmentalization that allowed him to justify the unjustifiable. The slow pace of his actions, the drawn-out steps, the repeated sequences, suggest sadism not as a symptom, but as a system. This wasn't about uncontrolled rage. It was about reclaiming a sense of identity through dominance, through fear, through pain. The process itself was the point, and once a ritual takes form in a disturbed mind, it begins to replace truth with its own logic. The crime becomes not just an act, but a belief, a language, a need. But there's another hidden layer we need to uncover. What happens when a person loses the ability to see others as real? When victims become objects in a personal myth? That distortion of perception is what we turn to next. Inside the courtroom, when Luis Alfredo Garavito described his crimes, what struck many was not the content of his words, but the absence of emotional connection to them. He spoke of events as if recounting something that happened to someone else. When asked by a judge how he managed to commit such acts repeatedly, he responded, "It wasn't me, not really. It was the beast." That term, the beast, came up again and again, not as metaphor, but as a separate entity. This wasn't just deflection. It hinted at a fractured identity, a mind that had learned to survive by dissociating from its own actions. Psychological evaluations conducted after his arrest revealed signs of severe trauma from childhood, including repeated sexual abuse and abandonment. These experiences may have carved deep fractures in Garavito's sense of self, creating internal compartments where guilt, violence, and memory could be stored and ignored. The transformation he described before each crime, often triggered by alcohol, was more than intoxication. It was a mental mechanism, a passage into another version of himself, one that didn't recognize the humanity of others because it barely recognized its own. In several documented confessions, Garavito would shift pronouns, referring to himself in the third person, or pausing as if struggling to align memory with identity. A forensic psychiatrist noted he constructed a dissociative shield so he could observe his actions without experiencing them. And in that detachment, his victims ceased to be people. They became symbols, carriers of something unresolved, perhaps even representations of his younger self, now transformed into something he needed to dominate or erase. The complexity of this mental dissociation challenges our perception of responsibility, evil, and identity. But it also opens the door to the darkest question of all. What happens when someone fully erases the boundary between victim and object? Let's follow that thread, because the next layer reveals how manipulation wasn't only directed outward, but turned inward, shaping the man behind the mask. To understand how Garavito remained invisible for so long, we need to look beyond the crimes and examine the character he performed. In nearly every town he passed through, Garavito introduced himself under a different name. He pretended to be a traveling salesman, a spiritual healer, or even a charity worker. In one documented case, he volunteered at a church event, handing out food to local children just weeks after committing another murder nearby. This wasn't coincidence, it was design. He wasn't hiding from people. He was shaping what they saw. Former neighbors recalled him as polite, respectful, even soft-spoken. He told convincing stories about losing his family, struggling with illness, and searching for honest work. A shopkeeper in Pereira later testified, he looked like someone who had been hurt, not someone who could hurt others. That contrast was his shield. By crafting a narrative of suffering and gentleness, Garavito tapped into a fundamental psychological bias, the tendency to empathize with those who appear wounded. He didn't just escape suspicion, he inverted it. But this manipulation wasn't only strategic, it became embedded in his identity. Over time, the false roles he played blurred with whatever remained of his original self. The mask didn't just conceal the predator, it became the person others knew. And perhaps, over time, it became the person he believed he was when not killing. That internal split between the man who comforted and the man who destroyed wasn't just functional. It was a psychological necessity for sustaining the double life. Now, let's go even deeper into this constructed persona. Because eventually, no mask holds forever, and in Garavito's case, the fracture began with something subtle, almost insignificant. But that single crack would soon unravel the entire illusion. Let's step into that moment, when the mask began to slip. The unraveling of Garavito's carefully constructed persona didn't begin with a dramatic mistake, but with a pair of broken glasses. Found at the scene of an attempted abduction, the glasses led investigators to a small group of suspects, and eventually to a man using a false identity who had been arrested for petty theft. That man was Luis Alfredo Garavito. At first, he denied everything, calm, composed, even helpful. But as evidence mounted, including maps, diary entries, and drawings of crime scenes found among his belongings, the cracks began to spread across the mask he had worn for years. What emerged in the interrogation room wasn't a man overwhelmed by guilt. It was a man who, in fragments, began to explain his crimes with chilling distance. In one recorded session, he said, "I tried to stop, I prayed, but the need came back stronger." That phrase, the need, became central to understanding his mentality. He didn't speak of anger or hatred. He described something closer to compulsion, as though the acts were an external force he could only temporarily resist. This self-narrative painted him not as a monster, but as a man overtaken by an inner storm he couldn't control. A disturbing form of self-victimization that blurred lines between responsibility and detachment. During trial proceedings, prosecutors noted how Garavito wept when shown images of the victims, yet within minutes returned to calm, even light conversation. Was this remorse, or was it a rehearsed emotional mimicry, another performance layered over the truth? Forensic psychiatrists who examined him found no consistent signs of guilt, only contradictions. A man who admitted to unspeakable violence, yet spoke of his desire to be forgiven. A man who understood the legal gravity of his actions, but not the human weight of them. But the final layer of this journey brings us to the most unsettling truth of all. What do we do with a mind that explains horror without truly feeling it? Let's take a closer look at how that mental void, that absence of empathy, shaped the impact of his sentencing and what it reveals about justice, identity, and the limits of psychological understanding. As we step back from the long and harrowing journey into the mind of Luis Alfredo Garavito, what remains is not clarity, but an unsettling quiet. His case doesn't offer closure, it offers confrontation. Confrontation with the possibility that someone who once held a child's hand in kindness could, moments later, commit the unthinkable. And that such transformation wasn't sudden, it was a progression, the result of internal fractures, unchecked compulsions, and a mental landscape shaped in isolation from empathy. During sentencing, the courtroom held its breath as Garavito was handed the longest prison term ever issued in Colombia, over 1,800 years. But due to legal limits, he could serve no more than 40. When asked if he believed he deserved a second chance, Garavito responded with calm conviction, "I've changed. God has forgiven me. I want to help others now." That statement stirred outrage among victims' families, but also raised deeper questions. Did he believe his own words, or had the performance simply shifted into a new role, from predator to penitent? The psychological portrait left behind is fragmented. A man who claimed transformation, yet never showed true insight into the gravity of what he had done. A man who spoke fluently of morality, while never acknowledging the identity of those he destroyed. And perhaps that is the darkest revelation, the absence not of remorse, but of connection. A void where perception of others should have lived. Garavito's mind challenges us to reconsider how far disconnection can go when left unchecked. Can trauma alone explain such distortion? Or are there forces deeper, darker, hidden beneath the surface of personality and perception? In the end, understanding a mind like his is not about forgiveness, it's about awareness. Because if such horror was shaped, what other minds might be too? If this reflection resonates with you, write below. The mind hides more than we dare to see. If you found meaning in this exploration, I invite you to continue walking this path with us. Subscribe to Criminal Psychology Unmasked, not for answers, but to keep asking better questions. Here, we explore minds not to excuse them, but to understand the hidden architecture beneath every act. Your voice matters in this space. If this analysis stirred something within you, write below. There's always a deeper origin. Each reflection adds another layer to this collective journey through the psychology of darkness. And if you value serious, thoughtful inquiry over easy conclusions, a like helps bring more visibility to content that respects the complexity of the human mind. But even the darkest patterns we observe today didn't emerge by chance. Every distorted thought, every fractured emotion has roots that stretch deep into the past. In the next episode, we'll step back into the early chapters of this story to uncover how this mind was shaped, layer by layer. I'll be waiting for you there.